All right, so welcome to everyone. My name is Carla Leitao, and I'm hosting the last Foundations series event, Foundations Piece, with YEHUDA SAFRAN, Professor YEHUDA SAFRAN. Thank you for coming, YEHUDA.
Thank you.
And I will just be introducing the series. So the Foundations is a series of events that I'm hosting at the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale inside the Italian Virtual Pavilion. This is part of the Space and Planetary Design Group, which is under the creative directorship of Ed Keller. The Virtual Italian Pavilion was curated by Tom Kovac and Alessandro Mellis, and it's titled City X Venice. And it responds to the larger question of the curatorship of Ashim Sarkis for the Venice Biennale, which is, how will we live together? And the Foundation series wants to engage key big questions about world making, to inquire on the grounds that we will walk on in the future and our role in creating those grounds. It is interested in design thinking and how this makes or shapes foundational systems that can ground or structure the ways by which we could all live together. And so in the Foundation series, we've looked at a number of topics. Crust, that looked at the ways in which we are creating a new geological crust with materials that we create and deposit on Earth, and the ways in which they create memory markers that can travel through deep time to endure a warning message of danger. We have also looked at token, at emerging economic structures based on digital currency. In weather, we looked at ways to collaborate and design with weather creating phenomena. And in habitat, we inquired on the potential makeups for our living units and reflected on the condition of envelope. In our final session, we engaged the most necessary scenario to ensure success for all the above, while being the most elusive to obtain peace. How can we create peace, and how important is it to enable the creation or design of all else? There is no need for inspiration to think about peace. Many, if not all of us, yearn for it quite frequently, and furthermore, peace is the infrastructure underlying the running of most forms of utopia. But most of us look for it, especially when confronted with its opposite, the many forms of war. Personally, for me, a thought that continues to be provocative is the use of the term political technology by Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer was one of the minds of the atomic bomb and referred to its discovery and deployment as a turning point that demanded another new invention, a political technology that could manage the new world that had emerged. Although Oppenheimer might have used technology in a metaphorical way, perhaps I've been touched by the use of this word because it seemed to imply some kind of a need of some kind of invention, a designed invention that would understand some kind of nearly magic trick that could wrangle or bypass several other more elusive ingredients and processes to articulate, might we say, fabricate or breed peace. The post-war period of the 20th century saw play out the different outcomes of this dialogue between warfare and structures for peace and the emergence of a more global conscious, even if ill-distributed. For instance, the creation of the United Nations in the post-war period, and also Buckminster Fuller World Games on the design realm were an attempt to remap the world and get collaborative teams around problems towards grand-scale thinking related to resources, their distribution, and modes of organization of society. This global conscious, also aided by technological mapping artifacts that helped bring forth the image of one aspect of our commonness, helped support as well an emerging environmental conscious. But if that conscious had its peaks of social and cultural movements, it missed true global reach, or shall we say resolution, during the 20th century, and appears now in the 21st century, still not as an urgent scenario, but as a political one, a divisive idea about commonness instead of a uniting one. Alternatively, the contemporary pandemic could have been the common enemy and pervasive environmental problem to emphasize the power of logistical organization that only common, maybe global, efforts of governance or at least coordination can achieve. Several cultural events have described the current pandemic as a portal or a window into existing realities that preceded it, that it made them more visible, legible, or the urgency of their subject matters more outstanding. One of these realities, and perhaps the most outstanding, is our yearning and yet proven difficulty to arrive at some semblance of work in progress peace. Not only are we not closer to models of world peace, the stress test of the pandemic seems to have created myriad fractures on already existing cooperative alliances or even just understandings. All foundational models of future world making one might aspire to are perhaps entwined or even dependent on concepts, models, inventions that make peace possible. Ultimately, to engage the big problems and questions of our time, we must tackle the unstable grounds whereupon we want to build the bridges that may connect our efforts together. This session looks at ways in which the question of world peace has been projected and imagined. How can we become close to achieving it? And with us today to discuss the topic of peace, I have YEHUDA SAFRAN, a longtime friend and mentor. YEHUDA SAFRAN is internationally known as a critic of art and architecture. He studied at St. Martin's School of Art, the Royal College of Art, and University College London. Art, architecture, and philosophy, respectively, were the studies of his, the subject of his studies. He has taught at a number of institutions, including the Architectural Association, Goldsmiths College, London University, Royal College of Art, John van Eyck Academy, Maastricht, Mendrisio, Columbia University, Harvard University, Ticino, Pratt Institute, and as well RISD. As well, he has been a visiting professor at Nanjing University, Tongji University. His writings have been published in numerous architecture, design, art, and cinema journals, including 9H, Casabella, Domus, Lotus, A+U, AA Files, Prototipo, and others. He has as well, he is the author and co-author of the publications Selected Papers, 12 Dialogical and Poetical Strategies, a seminar that he has run for decades. And as well, he was the author, co-author of I Have a Weakness for a Touch of Red, Essays on Architecture in Portugal, and also the other publication, Anish Kapoor, My Red Homeland. He was as well the author of Mies van der Rohe and another monography on Friedrich Kiesler, and as well the architecture of Adolf Loos. Currently, he lives and works in New York, where he directs the Potlatch Journal and teaches architecture at Pratt Institute. And I'm extremely excited to have this conversation with YEHUDA. Thank you so much, YEHUDA, for coming. I will give the table to you to discuss this topic, to present it to us, and to discuss it.
Good morning. Thank you very, very much. Good evening, probably in Venice. Thank you very, very much for the invitation. It's a subject that I did address early on in numerous ways. First of all, I must say that long before this Biennale took place, I did interview Hashem Sarkis at length, which was published in the Plan magazine originally, and then also on the site, the internet site of the Biennale. And indeed, among the issues that one has to raise if one considers how we are going to live together. The issue of peace is paramount. Architecture is hardly ever addressed it directly, but it does address it indirectly very much, nowhere more than in the issue of so-called international style and any such things. And indeed, the issue came up very much so already after the First World War with the competition for the League of Nations in Geneva, a competition for which Corbusier proposed an incredible, ambitious project, which was turned down on the technical excuse that it was presented in graphite and not in ink. But it was typical of that institution that meant to bring peace to the world, and in fact only prepared for the next and even more terrible war. Indeed, one of the most active principal figure in favor of universal perpetual peace in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was the Baroness Bertha von Suttern from Prague, who actually had I think, 90 letters exchanged with Alfred Nobel himself, and she was the one who convinced him to establish the Peace Nobel Prize. She died just a week before the opening of the First World War in 1914. She died in June. The war declared in August. And indeed, one of the great authors was then a young man in Vienna, Stefan Zweig, tells us about a conversation he had with her in which she insisted that young people like him should do much more to prevent that war, if they are to prevent a war. Otherwise, the war will come. And she ended by saying that she wished that she would turn out to be completely a fool, she said. Unfortunately, of course, she turned to be right. And Zweig himself later on admitted that he realized that they did not do whatever they could do at the time to prevent that war, which in fact was nothing but, if you like, a prolegomena for the Second War that followed shortly after. There were many other people, which I will not mention, of course, who did advocate some form of peace, some form of global peace. Aldous Huxley in 1928 and 1936 published a text in which he said, "What are you going to do about it?" That's a very typical kind of English way of putting things. What are you going to do about it? In fact, he himself was not able to do much. He did, as a young man, try to volunteer for the First World War, but was rejected on the ground of ill health. And eventually he actually found a refuge in his life in Los Angeles. But there were many other, and I will not mention. But I would like to concentrate on two aspects which are very well connected. The first aspect, as I explained already, in relation to the first aspect that I already mentioned in relation to the international style in connection with the League of Nations is, of course, the idea that cosmopolitanism is connected or is dialectically dialectically related to world perpetual peace. In other words, that you could not have perpetual peace, world peace, without cosmopolitanism, and you could not have cosmopolitanism without peace. And interestingly enough, the man with whom we associate the idea of cosmopolitanism originally is no less than Diogenes. Who was Diogenes? Well, many people are aware of something that came out of him, but in a very bastardized version, and that is cynicism. Cynicism, almost everybody who has any kind of rudiments of education would know what a cynic is, but most likely only that part which is contemporary. What he would not know, that the term cynic comes from Diogenes as well, because Diogenes tried to rid himself of whatever he could and see whether this would make him less of a man. And as he got rid of just about everything, he found himself living like a dog, living in a burrow. And that's hence hence the word dog is connected with the idea of the cynic, like a dog. Well, if I was a dog, I would give you much more objective report on the subject. But as I'm not, I will do what I can. So Diogenes was the first that we know of to refuse to identify himself from any city where he was born or where he was living. And refusing that, he actually catapulted himself into this extraordinary category of a true cosmopolitan. Of course, in different parts of the world, in different ways, there are moments in which people entertain comparable ideas of themselves. For example, in Russia, before the Russian Revolution, we are just today, actually, we are celebrating the Russian Revolution. As you know, at the time of the Russian Revolution, the Russian calendar was a little bit out of sync with the Gregorian calendar for the rest of Europe. And what was 29th of October was actually 7th of November. So today, in one calendar, it is a celebration of the Russian Revolution. Be this as it may, the important thing is that until the Russian Revolution, there was a very powerful movement in Russia connected with the cosmos. And these people believe that it's more important to realize the connection we have with the cosmos as a cosmists than any other kind of identity, be it national, local, or whatever. Now, this went on, as I said, until the revolution, and maybe a little bit also overspeed into the revolution itself and after. Because the cosmos is the idea of a world which is far larger, which involve our existence among a constellation whose measure we cannot even fathom. We cannot. But the radical point in this story, I think, is the moment in the beginning of the 19th century, just before the end of the 18th century, in 1795, Immanuel Kant published his proposal for perpetual peace. So you may well ask yourself, why then? And why Kant when he was already fairly old man? Well, the thing to remember which is not always easy, is the French Revolution, because the French Revolution in 1789 meant such an upheaval in every type of convention and dogma, including the rule of law and what it meant. The idea that you can change the law, the idea that you can write a new law was always there. It's so much, it was so powerful that in the early years of the revolution, a land surveyor called Babeuf, Auguste Babeuf, proposed that the land itself of the entire territory of France should be redivided on equal measure. And since he was a land surveyor, he knew exactly what he was talking about. He knew it so well and so much that he was immediately taken to court. And in his defense, he made a very famous speech, which became known as the conspiracy of the equals, the conspiracy of the equals, because he had the idea, this brilliant idea, that the land should be redivided equally among all the citoyens. Of course, the French Revolution itself tried to popularize its ideals and ideas by offering citizenship to whoever, anywhere in the world, who would agree with the principle of the revolution. Even so, Babeuf was condemned to death, but his cri de coeur, his appeal to what he called the conspiracy of the equal, his appeal to a just distribution of the land remained singular. And it is only comparable to what came a few years later in the appeal of Immanuel Kant for perpetual peace. You may not observe readily the internal and intimate connection between the idea of a just world, between the idea of equal distribution of the land and the idea of perpetual peace. But this is one of the things that I offer you today. Immanuel Kant, by 95, already completed his critique. Don't forget that if Immanuel Kant is playing still such a formidable role in our life, is precisely around the word critique. Even in the architectural school and schools of art, the critique is actually a derivative of the Kantian critique, because Kant brought about what he believed to be a Copernican revolution insofar as he claimed that the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, is not only unknown, is unknowable. And therefore, all human knowledge is nothing but the result of the projection of our mind onto the world, and therefore bound to be limited and bound to be forever distanced from the thing in itself, the Ding an sich. Of course, you could say that in his doctrine of learned ignorance of Nicolas de Cusa in the 16th century, the insight is already there, because Nicolas of Cusa already claimed in his doctrine of learned ignorance that human mind is no more than a polygon compared with the knowledge of the world, which is circular. And therefore, no matter how many times you divide the polygon, you still have a polygon as opposed to the roundness of the thing in itself. Be this as it may, the Kantian insight was of greater consequences in all fields, whether it was the critique of pure reason, whether it was the critique of practical reason, whether it was a synthetic a priori judgment, which is the aesthetic judgment, which he claimed to be the case, which is still a perplexing proposition on any account. The important thing is that following the French Revolution, which took place in 1789, that is to say, merely just 6 years before that text on perpetual peace. So you could say that one of the things that, as it were, encouraged Kant or made him aware of the necessity and the need for perpetual peace was precisely that which happened only so little time before. And indeed, as a result of the Napoleonic invasion, Germany undergone a great deal of havoc and military confrontation initiated by this conflict. I would say that only a German jurist have sorted out 100 years later in the most terrible form. And indeed, Karl Schulz, in his idea of enemies and friends, his ideas of legal justification for the worst horrors that can be imagined is precisely, if you like, the opposite side, the inverse side of the perpetual peace of which Kant has written. So you ask yourself, what are the chances if perpetual peace is so dialectically dependent on cosmopolitanism, and if cosmopolitanism is so completely interdependent on perpetual peace, then how can we have either? Or could we have neither? In the 20s, the League of Nations in Geneva established a committee for an intellectual pursuit internationally. And that committee, the seat of that committee was not Geneva, in fact, it was Paris. And they did write in, I think it was already 1930, they did write to Einstein, and they asked him to enter into epistolary exchange with somebody of his choice on a subject of his choice. Einstein decided to focus on the issue of peace. He called it Warum Krieg? Why war? And he wrote his correspondence, he decided would be Sigmund Freud. Freud agreed, and Einstein wrote a letter to him in which he proposed precisely something not unlike the Kantian perpetual peace, to which Freud replied in a rather long letter. We know all these details partly thanks to one of the Austrian chancellor after the Second World War was Bruno Kreisky. And Bruno Kreisky, when he died, a foundation was established in his honor called the Forum for International Dialogue. And that Forum for International Dialogue decided on the occasion of the 100 years for the relativity paper of 1905, decided to publish these letters again and to organize a conference on the topic. I was, you could say, fortunate or unfortunate enough to be invited for this conference and to write a text on these letters. And I must admit that in the course of reading these letters, I became aware, I then remembered that I've read similar letters between Tolstoy and Gandhi, because when Tolstoy discovered that Gandhi developed what he called the non-violence forms of resistance. He got so enthusiastic that he began to correspond with Gandhi. And indeed, when you compare these two sets of letters, you realize that with all the intellectual formidable achievement, neither Gandhi nor neither Freud nor Einstein had very strong feeling for their fellow human beings as a collective. And their interest was above all motivated by a very strong rational streak rather than empathy or identity with the people whom they address, which was exactly the opposite of Tolstoy and Gandhi. Tolstoy was already involved in the issues of peace. Indeed, he learned a lot from Proudhon. Even the title of War and Peace came from Proudhon. So he was engaged in these issues for a very long time. Be that from a certain Christian perspective, but I would say entirely of his own. The problem with Freud, Einstein correspondence was that Freud strongly disagreed that there would be such a possibility as a world without war. He argued that ultimately in the battle between Eros and Thanatos, Thanatos always wins. I doubt whether his argument was correct, because if Thanatos always won, there would be no life on Earth. And since there is life on Earth, in spite of all the wars and hardship and famine and everything else, then perhaps it would be more correct to say that in the short term, Thanatos wins. But in the long terms, it seems to me that if Eros did not win, then life would have been of a short duration. And there would have been no continuation of life. Be this as it may, their exchange of letters was very inconclusive, as you can imagine. Also because the commitment of Einstein to peace was not unlimited. He did say that he was not a pacifist, and if his family and friends were under threat, he would resort to arms. And as we know, he did. His contribution to the effort of his fellow scientists to convince the American administration to produce the bomb witnessed precisely that dialectic attitude that he adopted. Was he right? Was he wrong? It's very likely that he was wrong, that this effort should not have been made, perhaps, and we would have been saved much of the calamities brought about by the production of the bomb and the consequences of a world regime based on permanent threat, something that indeed Oppenheimer failed to appreciate. He failed to appreciate that no sooner that he gave in the hands of the military that weapon, he lost all control of its further usage, something that it never occurred to him. While I must say that the German scientists, as far as I can see, especially Heisenberg, were intelligent enough not to do similar mistake. And they managed to put off the regime by any effort, by telling them that it would be too costly and will take too long to produce. And with these kind of arguments, they managed to clear themselves of any such possibilities. Something that was confirmed in many ways subsequently but not before the end of the war and the capturing of at least 12 of the German scientists were captured and held in captivity in England while the bomb was used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And if you read the autobiography of Heisenberg, he tells us that they were in a farmhouse north of Cambridge, England, and they fell on the ground crying when they heard on the news what happened. And they kept saying, how could our friends do that? How could they do it when we didn't, That's exactly one of the most terrible stories of the recent past. But I think it is for the honor of the Kreisky Foundation, indeed, they did produce this book called Warum Krieg? Why War? In which they invited several people to comment on the letters and also organized a conference in Vienna at the time, meaning at the time, something like nearly 15 years ago, when we were celebrating the 100 years of the relativity paper. Einstein was in Vienna before. He met Freud when Freud wanted to meet him in Berlin years earlier. Freud was came out very disappointed and confused because, as he wrote to a friend of his, first of all, Einstein was terribly young when he made his discoveries. And Freud was in his middle age when he made his own. And secondly, no sooner he made his discoveries, he was celebrated, thanks especially to a great German physicist called Max Planck, who invented the quantum mechanics, who immediately realized the importance of that paper. And unlike Freud, who not only did it take him such a long time to make his discoveries, but when he made his discoveries, it was not really accepted readily, certainly not by the establishment of his profession anywhere. And he had to fight to defend it. So on these two grounds, the meeting was very made Freud unhappy, definitely. But Einstein himself was in Vienna before, and indeed it was mentioning it in this context because when he was asked who did he want to meet in Vienna, his only request was to meet with a physicist, a fellow physicist who called himself by then Joseph Linkaus. And Joseph Linkaus was a physicist who made an important contribution to the distribution of electricity on a long distance and such things. However, his contribution was of such a technical value that he became a terribly rich man and dedicated himself to utopian writing, which was focused on the invention of what he called the army of war. And his idea was that if every young man and woman would contribute a year or two of their life to this army of war, then there would be no need in the world which could not be satisfied, and war would become totally redundant. This is the only man that Einstein wanted to meet in Vienna when he was official guest of the city of Vienna years earlier. So I would say that, and indeed, in relation to Gandhi, he said, when Gandhi died, he famously said that future generation would find it difficult to believe that such a man actually walked on earth. So you can see that, how shall we put it, that the interrelationship between people who were occupied with these issues are quite part of the story itself. Indeed, Tolstoy read the only book that Bertha von Suttner published in her lifetime, Drop Your Weapons, the title of the book. And Tolstoy remarks were very apt insofar as he said, what a great insight this woman did have, but she did not, in his view, had the talent to give it full expression. Well, as you know, Tolstoy was very great in giving a full expression to his feeling in War and Peace. That did not really prevent the world from going into war again and again and again. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Wow, Yehuda, that was so wonderful. So brilliant. Thank you so much. I would like to ask the audience if they have questions or comments. That was just, as usual, the Yehuda way of edit. Every single phrase is just very precious. So that was really, really wonderful to listen. And I missed it. Really missed it. After having said on some of the seminars, I was missing this. Yeah, so I will ask the audience if they have some questions or comments. I would give them a little bit of time if they want to formulate something. Oh, you cannot unmute. Let me unmute you. Yes, you can unmute and start video. Yes, please.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I'm like quite not confident in myself commenting or like asking questions actually in these matters. But I mean, these like correspondence between Freud and Einstein was quite interesting to me in a way that I'm like recently also very much interested in like learning like the general relativity and like its like implications, and also undergoing like a psychoanalytic process and try to like go like and dig in myself and also like trying to learn those things. I was always thinking in a way that like sort of is metaphorically I'm kind of relating the gravity and force and eventually violence in togetherness. I don't know how that will sound, but like sort of like how the objects, how masses are deforming space-time is actually like using as like, of course, it's sort of a force in physical terms, and force like the other name, like the metaphorically force also relates to violence in a way. And also like it all like always like keeps me thinking about the relationship of those things, like the actual gravitational forces and the violence of like people that have as a force in themselves. And like also like this thing between the eros and the thanatos is like the pleasure and the pain, and like the pain is always like stronger, therefore the pleasure exists. It's like I don't know, it's just like a thought that I can't ever like materialize, but it's sort of like floating around. Just want to like mention that.
Carla, would you like me to respond directly?
Yes, please.
Well, I think you've raised a very important and extraordinary interesting issues to which we don't have a very good answer. Yes, potentially the parallel that you brought between, say, gravity and pain may well be significant. It may well be that there are such connections. It may well be that the world is far more interconnected that we can observe. The only thing we can say so far is that what we can observe is terribly limited. We have to imagine things in order to observe them. And our failure to imagine is paramount. It took mankind to realize that actually the center of the universe is not Earth. It's only, 400 years that we live with this novelty. So if such an absurd thing mankind could have lived for so long, just imagine all the rest of it. Newton famously said that man's knowledge is compared to a drop of water in the ocean. So if for him, human knowledge was a drop in the ocean, just imagine what it is for everybody else. It's not even a drop. In other words, it's totally insignificant. So the fact that our knowledge, and I don't mean your knowledge, my knowledge, I mean as a mankind, human knowledge is so bloody limited. And that's the reason why we get so excited about prizes such as Nobel Prize and so on. And it is very nice that Madame, the Baroness von Strohen convinced Alfred Nobel to establish a Nobel Peace Prize. Obviously, it was not his idea. And as you know, he did not establish it in many other incredible topics, like mathematics. There's no Nobel Prize. Also, there was no Nobel Prize in economics, I must tell you. But the economists, whatever you say about them, they are very clever people. They are very opportunistic and pragmatic. And by raising money from the Bank of Sweden and other sources, they managed to establish their own Nobel Prize. But don't get it wrong. There was no Nobel Prize in economics. It's the economists who gave themselves that prize. And they're still doing it. They're still giving it to themselves every year. So do other people. People love to give themselves whatever they can. But when it comes to knowledge, the problem is the source. You cannot give what you don't have, or it's exceedingly difficult, It's funny that Huxley published a book about the two graces and other stories. It's funny that he tried to change the number, but you know why it's 3? It's not only because the number 3 is nice and it is a trinity and all that. It's also because the idea is that giving, receiving, and giving again. So, I wish I knew how it came to his mind to call it just 2 graces. But my point is simple, and I just repeat it in several different ways. And that is that whatever knowledge is possible, it depends on the imagination. And whatever our ability to imagine, it is in large part depends on how we share our life with other human beings. And so the only conclusion, therefore, I can draw is that if the condition for perpetual peace were more achievable, realizable, then the limits of what we can imagine about everything, as you mentioned, including our feeling, our experience of pain and pleasure, etc., it will affect just about every aspect of our life. Every aspect of our life will be affected by such imagination. And therefore, such imagination is fundamental for thinking, indeed, how should we live together? What are the conditions that makes life together possible, even desirable? And I would say that one of the conditions sine qua non, without which nothing could happen, is precisely something like a perpetual peace, which, as I explained to you, is completely interdependent on what we call cosmopolitanism. The cosmopolitanism of Diogenes, pre-Socratic philosopher, is necessary ingredient of that condition that I would describe as the ideal condition to allow us to benefit from our short duration on earth with our fellow human being. Perpetual peace is precisely the sine qua non, is that without which nothing else could be realized. Well, that's my answer. If it was a question.
I actually have a comment question to you. It's more of a question, Yehuda. Do you personally think that this kind of rationality found in the exchange between Einstein and Freud was coming from a certain bias that had to do with their expertise? So they were both dealing with disciplines that were very analytic, or by a zeitgeist of the 20th century, or that it was more of a personal condition, that they were personally that way, they had those kinds of personalities that thought in that way. Because of your comparison between the exchange between Einstein and Freud and Tolstoy and Gandhi shows that there is a diversity of how one could deal with this subject. And I wonder if you find that it's all context, and if it's all cultural context as again a zeitgeist, or it has to do with the disciplinary expertise that bias these human beings in a particular way, or personal. What's your personal take, informed personal take, as I imagine you've read on them quite a bit?
Well, it is a very large, important question, to which it would take almost, I would say, to exaggerate it nicely, I would say it would take lifetime to answer, because each one of these people is that I mentioned in this exchange of letters is a different world. It's a totally different world. It's I mean, even in terms of culture, if it was Tolstoy writing to Rabindranath Tagore, and Rabindranath Tagore was writing to Tolstoy, I would say, no matter what the cultural difference, there was certain kind of similarity there. One was a very elite group of people. Tolstoy was Count Tolstoy, don't forget, he was a huge landowner. He had more self than any of his contemporaries, unbelievable. And so was Rabindranath Tagore, The fact that both of them used their resources for a good purpose made them very comparable. Indeed, Rabindranath Tagore got the Nobel Prize for his literature, though he was also a painter, as you know, and many other things. But I would say if it was a correspondence between Tagore and Tolstoy, I would say these two people have something from point of view of their social cultural position relatively to the people they represent, they have a lot in common. But Gandhi was not like Rabindranath Tagore. But Gandhi came from a much, much more modest background, incomparably modest, if you compare it to incomparable, I say. And then I say compared to Rabindranath Tagore. Gandhi was really from a very modest background, and what occupied the mind of Gandhi was of different kind of urgency. After all, his people were under the British thumb for nearly 400 years. The Russian tortured themselves, which is not less of a burden, but a different kind of burden, no doubt, totally different. So, I could spend, I don't know, days, years drawing this comparison because they are endless, because they were so different. And even Freud and Einstein, they both came from a comparable background. Freud was more modest. His father was a carpet dealer, but with a great collection of Jewish jokes. It's very important. Einstein's father, on the other hand, was already a great producer of electricity, which meant that Einstein's library, as he grew up, was full of the relevant stuff, you could say. So he had a great advantage in many ways over Freud. And indeed, Freud stylistically is superior. He uses the German language with greater facility, with greater grace, I would say. For those of you who can read German, Freud, all the prizes he got is usually for his literature, for his writings, He never got prize for his medical or analytical insights, but he did get several prizes for his writings because he wrote beautifully. Einstein did not write especially beautiful, but we care so much because of the thought content of Einstein, which is indisputably very clear, even on topics that he's no expert. But, and indeed, in this topic, it's very complicated, as you know. At the time when Einstein wrote these letters, he had no idea in what he would get involved only 10 years later, right? It's not just a joke that the bomb was his invention. I mean, the thing is the people who developed it could have done nothing what they could if there was not the theory of relativity, you see, the E equal mc square. So Einstein became responsible personally for a catastrophe in terms of weapon and in terms of not only the possibility of war. In the West, people forget Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's too easy to forget. It happened to different people in other parts of the world, and that's it. But that's not the case. It happened. What happened to them happened to all of us. And I don't want to be in the place of Einstein himself. I'm sure he suffered greatly. I knew indirectly because my teacher in the high school, I went to a special high school where the teacher was a man called Franz Ollendorf, who was a world expert electromagnetic fields. And he was a friend of Einstein. And every summer he went to see him. And he was a member of the atomic committee, and he resigned from the atomic committee when they decided to make a bomb. And so every end of every summer, he came back from his visit to his old friend Einstein. And one knew that the burden of what did happen was not a small one. So I don't know if he would have written the same thing after that story, right? I don't think so. In fact, I would say that very likely he wouldn't. Vice versa, The thing is that in life, there's so much that is irreversible. Once the genie came out of the bottle, you could not put it back in. And America, the propaganda was great, and people were stupid enough to believe that the Russian or whatever could do what they did because of some spies, which is totally stupid. The only spy could tell was that something was done. But how and so on, that is every country had its own people who worked it out, and in time, as you know, this is an issue that is not yet ended. We are in the middle of the attempt to some powers in the world like to be able to tell who can have it and who cannot have it, and they slowly realize that their ability to control who can have it or who cannot have it is very limited. It's very limited for n number of reasons. It's just not possible, because I think the overwhelming thing is that human knowledge is limited as it is. It's also unstoppable. And what we are capable of knowing, sooner or later, we will know. And if some people know, then other people, in no time, we know the same thing. And that's what we are learning. We are learning again and again. And in spite of people in power who pretend that they can stop other people from taking advantage of their knowledge. No, it's not possible. Not that this knowledge is infinite, but limited as it is, it's not limited in the sense that anybody who has the capacity for knowledge, sooner or later will know what everybody else knows. And there's no way to stop it, no way to constrain it.
If only there was an equation for peace, right? If only in the theory of relativity there would be the equivalent for that, which would not be through annihilation, of course.
In some sense, you could say that the text that is not very well known, but the text of Immanuel Kant on perpetual peace is a kind of equation of this kind, except that unlike more useful equation, this equation is more or less forgotten. Even in the philosophical literature, there are not many people read it, not many people comment on it. There are a few books which I've seen, meaning that here and there are people who pay attention to it. If I pay attention to it, it's not because it's so well-known, popular. I pay attention to it precisely because I think it's essential to appreciate how it is important, how it is fundamental. As I said, I see it as a sine qua non, that without which all the other will not stand to any test. In other words, if we are to live together, in this central pavilion, the Biennale that Hashem Sarkis, I imagine himself created, there's one niche about 4 by 4 meters, not very large, but there's a voice of a woman, and she reads the name of 300 villages in Palestine that were destroyed in 1948. And for me, that part of the pavilion was perhaps the finest part of the pavilion, because it is about the past. But you see, the past is never free from the future, even though the future in our language, at least, comes after the past. In many ways, it is in the past. And if that part of the world is going to have any future, then that past must be part of it. And I think to put that past in that cubic space with the voice of a woman reading the names of the villages, with quite almost indifferent photos of each of these villages, I think that is remarkable. For me, it is the most remarkable exhibit of that pavilion. Precisely because, as I said, that if there is any future for us on Earth together, then perpetual peace must be the one and without which, the one ingredient without which all the rest could not take place, in my view.
Wonderful, miraculous phrases. Shall we have some more questions from the audience?
I'm happy to answer. If there's any question, I can answer.
Or comments, if they also. Everyone's very shy today.
Right. Also, they can see me, but I can't see them.
Yes, everyone is welcome to turn on your videos. We just keep them off when during the lectures, just in case it's, if there's a crash or so. Hi, Orkun. Hi, Luis. Any other questions or comments? I wanted to give space to people because I know sometimes it's difficult to start. Yes. Orkun, if you want, did you wanted to ask anything else? Just because you've already spoken, don't let that stand in the way.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, like don't have much to add, to be honest. It's just yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, like it's always very mind-opening to think about those things and listen, and like so it's a tricky thing. Like when like we go and as you say, like every knowledge is almost like possible based on the imagination. So and it's always a death trap that whatever you think is I mean, I almost like go into these like nothing is going to work, or nothing is like it's become like too sometimes pessimistic about these like things. I mean, in general, not only about peace, but about like the knowledge in general. I don't know, it's like, but it's always, I think, refreshing to think and try to find what is beyond imaginable so that we can extend our imagination further. I don't know, it's like a sort of like a general comment in the topic that we have, but
Yes, indeed. One thing, Yehuda, that I was also, this reminds me of a common question that I had for you as well in relationship to this session. I've always been interested in that term that Oppenheimer has brought up, political technology, because of the way in which we tend to frame inventions, sometimes inventions that can do, let's say, magic tricks, therefore solve things quickly, as technologies. So we tend to frame technology as, well, we tend to use that word whenever some kind of invention seems to suddenly consolidate a lot of connections that didn't exist before, and to move them into a place where there's a term for what a technology is, but also whatever we invented, but also that it suddenly advances the resolution of a problem, whatever that is, quickly. And one of the things that you brought up was exactly the way in which sometimes there's an attempt also to do the opposite, which is, in order to avoid war, to create delays in some kind of acceleration. So for instance, Heisenberg's trying to create resistances or delays into the fabrication of what would be a technological war machine by using what was at his disposal. So like the for instance, to say that it was too costly or that it would be too time consuming, that it would be too late. So there's also this other relationship between acceleration and speed and delay and literally like the presence of time sometimes associated with this, what seems to be a certain conflict between the idea of war and wisdom, or technology and wisdom, speed and reflection. And I was wondering if that's something that is also a dialectic for you, that is kind of present.
Well, the key, you see, the key issue is always human. In other words, if you know what human beings are like, especially if you know the human beings that you are dealing with, then you can direct yourself. And it's nothing to do with, I think that Oppenheimer was just a very smart man, and he invented and used many exquisite kind of expression like the one that you of course, technology has a politics, very importantly so. Unfortunately, Oppenheimer did not realize that once he gave the military a weapon, then he would have no say in how it is used, you see. He admits himself in his book, The Open Mind, if you read it, he admits as much, that he had the illusion that he will retain a certain amount of control and a certain amount of say in the following. And he did not realize, or little did he realize, that he would have no control whatsoever. You see, and the German physicists as well, you see, the German physicists, they knew the regime, you know, and they knew that Hitler and his friends were convinced that the war will be short, that they will win quickly. And only because he had this knowledge and that he could rely on, that he could use this argument in getting the politicians off his back. Because once he told them, not only that it will be exorbitantly expensive, but once he told them that it won't be ready in time, then they lost interest in it, because they were convinced, fortunately, that the war will not last very long, you see. Now, could he use it if he didn't know that? Of course not. You know, for many years, everybody was watching for papers coming from the archive of Heisenberg to understand exactly what happened. And people wrote plays, you know, The Physicist by Dürrenmatt, for example. There were at least 3 plays written on that issue. And you see also what people don't realize, that not every physicist was so convinced and ready to operate. For example, Wolfgang Pauli. Wolfgang Pauli, who was kind of a genius of physicists, who discovered the neutrino very early on mathematically. Other people got Nobel Prize for discovering the actual particle in the depths of mines and under tons of ice. But he discovered it mathematically. And he was in America because his grandfather was a rabbi in Prague, and he didn't think that Switzerland was safe enough, so he came to the States. And but he explicitly did not participate in the Manhattan Project. And you know what he called the physicists that participate in the Manhattan Project? He called them the gangsters, you know? And there was one year in which he and the great Austrian logician, Kurt Gödel, and Bernard Russell were invited to Einstein House in Mercer Street. I can't remember which day it was, Tuesday, Thursday. They met every week. and nobody knows what they said. Still nobody knows, because the only one paragraph that Gödel wrote apropos these meetings is nasty about Russell. And the only one paragraph that Russell wrote about these meetings is nasty about Gödel. Obviously, because you see, Gödel works on logic, showed that Russell life achievement could not be achieved because Russell life achievement was to reduce mathematics to logic. And Gödel works on logic, showed that even logic is not logical in the end. They are arbitrary. They are axioms. They are incomplete theories, etc., etc. So you could not reduce logic to mathematics to logic. And that meant that this life project could not be achieved. So there's no surprise that these two people left paragraphs only, and they met week after week. Anyhow, I'm saying it apropos this issue, which is the participation. That Pauli did not participate, expressively not participate. He did not participate, in silence. So, what should we say? The only thing we can say is that we too often forget how much, in fact, how much responsibility is in the hands of individual people who may act like this, who may act like that. But if they act in this way or that way, it's because of their responsibilities, what they can think of, what they can feel, what they can hope for, etc., that dictate how they would act, how would they respond. And I think the story of, we especially a little bit focus on these extreme weapons for good reason. But it's not the first time. It's in the First World War, there was this gas. And this gas was also invented by a great scientist, a friend of Einstein. And you know that with the opening of the war, Einstein tried to enlist scientists in Berlin to sign paper against the war. But as I said, among his best friends was this chemist who invented the death gas. So do you see, it's so difficult and so full of very personal kind of connection and conflicts and contradictions. Yeah.
Yes, the extreme responsibility that exists in silence itself as well, right?
Right.
Very
well,
important.
the 3 words of James Joyce in the portrait of the artist as a young man, Daedalus, silence, cunning, silence, exile, and cunning. These are the 3 conditions. And you see, the story is not new. I mean, look at the story of Daedalus. We regard Daedalus as the father of us all, as far as architecture. And who was Daedalus? Apparently, he escaped from Athens because he was involved in some murder to do with exactly with his craft, And then the king wanted him to design a labyrinth so that he could keep the Minotaur, who was the son of Pasiphae, his wife, and the bull that was given to him by the gods, to keep him. And Daedalus designed. And what happened then? The king did not want that anybody else would have the secrets of his labyrinth. So he forbade Daedalus and his son Icarus from leaving the island. It's then that Icarus invents his wings, right? And it's then that Daedalus can't really hold himself. He's so excited that he's flying in the sun, forgetting the warning of his father not to get too high. He does get high, and he falls into the water, you know. And we do have this beautiful painting in Brussels of Bruegel, of the fall of Icarus. And when you look at this painting, what do you see? You see a tiny white splash of Icarus falling into the water. And then the boats continue to sail with their sails full of wind that is blown by the same sun that melt the wings of Icarus. And then right up front, in the front side of the paintings, you see the peasant continue to plow his land as if nothing happened. And that's exactly how it is. That's what the beauty of this painting is. So you can see already in this kind of formidable kind of story of the, if you like, one of the earliest architects in Western culture, that it's fraught with this conflict and contradiction, that you have problems dealing with power, problems for obeying power.
Mm-hmm. Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been just, I've heard some parts of this story, of some of the stories you told today in pieces, but it's wonderful to have it as a whole. And thank you so much for all the things that you've opened up from them. It was really an incredible treat.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone that came to the series, to the Foundation series, and participated and listened. This was really a kind of a wonderful experiment for me to do this and to have the pleasure of to speak with whom I spoke and to hear your questions and your feedback. And I look forward to doing more and to talk more about these important questions. And again, so excited that we concluded with peace and with YEHUDA. Thank you.